On behalf of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, I want to welcome you to this two-part presentation on managing historic landscapes and gardens. I'm Calder Loth, an architectural historian who has a special interest in the relationship between historic buildings and their landscape settings. And I hope the examples we will see and discuss in this presentation will help you develop a critical eye and will encourage informed management of landscaping treatments, not only of historic structures, but also of new traditional architecture. The subtitle of this presentation is Arboricytophobia. It's a word I made up, and I'm not even sure how to spell it. It's roughly translated as the fear of cutting down trees, which will be a theme referenced throughout our discussion. So to begin, if you had to describe the essence of a garden in one word, what would that word be? I think a good choice is control. A garden is a controlled landscape. The image we see here is not a natural landscape. It may be beautiful, but it's also contrived. Keeping a garden performing as intended requires control, whether it's an ornamental garden like this, or even a vegetable garden. A vegetable garden or orchard requires special control in order for it to produce what you want. And even a deliberately designed naturalistic look, such as Wisley Garden in England, requires control to keep its desired look. Or an extreme example, a naturalistic Japanese public garden. This requires constant tending and control to maintain its carefully calculated natural appearance, albeit a rather contrived, if not a poetical one. Well, what happens if you cease control? Well, this is the site of a large colonial garden of a plantation called Wilton, near Richmond, Virginia. Wilton's 1750s mansion was dismantled and rebuilt 25 miles away in the 1920s. The garden was left on its own, with no control, resulting in its reversion to this wilderness. And what happens if you forego any maintenance or control around your own home? Well, nature can overtake your yard and even your house if left uncontrolled. It's all a matter of management and a critical eye. Gardens and landscapes are dynamic organisms, meaning they are constantly changing every moment. Regular maintenance is necessary to maintain their desired effect. With these thoughts in mind, I want to look at several examples of historic architecture and landscape involving issues of management, and see how they've been dealt with. Now, because I worked for Virginia's Historic Preservation Office for many years, most of the examples we'll see involve properties in Virginia, with which I've had some direct or indirect involvement, and can provide background information about action taken. Well, the first is Thomas Jefferson's state capitol, completed in 1786 on a hilltop in Richmond. Its temple form originally dominated the city like the Parthenon on the Acropolis, as shown in this 1790s watercolor by Benjamin Henry Latrobe. The Capitol received its first serious landscape design in the 1840s, a composition of curved walks and greenery by the famous Scottish landscape architect John Notman, known particularly for his romantic public cemetery designs. A late 19th century photo shows a portion of this scheme, some curving walks and two curious little trees. But the Capitol dominates the scene. Well, the Capitol was expanded in 1906 with flanking wings housing new legislative chambers. This architect's rendering shows how the Capitol would yet be a stately visual element in the heart of the city. But Virginia is in the south, and this building with its monumental white columns was once the capital of the South. And what's the magical complement to white columns in the south? Well, magnolias. So 2 magnolia grandiflora were soon planted to frame the portico. Well, magnolias grow, and 70 years later, this was the scene. And the reason people ceased to pay much attention to this National Historic Landmark building was that few had properly seen it. Magnolias are evergreen. This mask is year-round. Well, the right tree eventually became diseased and had to be taken down. And since you can't have asymmetry, with much agony and debate, the left tree was also slated for removal. Well, aborosatophobia definitely fueled the deliberations. It takes the approval of numerous government entities to remove a Capitol Square tree. I tried to assuage the distress about the tree's removal by pointing out that there were 32 more magnolia trees on Capitol Square. They are not rare. So now we have this same view following magnolia removal. For the first time in many decades, Virginia's Capitol once again is a prominent visual element in the capital city. Now fast forward a few years. The Capitol underwent a major underground expansion to house additional meeting rooms, museum space, mechanicals, and other facilities. The project included installing a new classical-style public entrance at the bottom of the hill, allowing entrance at grade. This photo was taken soon after completion. The plants in the entrance's wing walls have since spread out to give the entrance a more grotto-like character. Now, a special benefit of this scheme is that it forces visitors to see the Capitol as Jefferson intended, as the temple on the hill. Prior to that, visitors entered via a rear ground floor entrance and were not even aware of the building's elevated position. Happily, trees can't be planted on top of the underground addition, so this view is locked in. Thus, a historic prospect has been reinstated, and I trust the magnolias have been forgotten. We'll now look at another Capitol Square landmark, Virginia's Governor's Mansion, a tidy federal dwelling designed by Alexander Paris and completed in 1813. We see a few bushes in this 19th century print, but no foundation planting on the facade. Now we leap to a 1940s view. The mansion lost some of its architectural detailing following the Civil War, but it got landscaping. Probably around the 1920s, it received a surfeit of balls of boxwood. Now there seems to be an unwritten law in Richmond that proper houses must be fronted by balls of boxwood. They are ubiquitous, as we will learn. Even after the mansion's 1988 exterior restoration, when missing architectural details were reinstalled, the front was still bounded by balls of boxwood. Well, the boxwood became infected with boxwood decline, so as they died, they were replaced with new boxwood. And they soon died too, because the blight had contaminated the soil. This constant replacing was both problematic and expensive. The Mansion Committee on which I serve proposed replacing the boxwood with beds of flowers that bloomed all year round. I said this was okay for a suburban backyard, but not appropriate for a historic official residence. So what to do? Well, I recommended removing the boxwood and not replacing them with anything. Shock, horror, a naked front? Well, to make a point, I showed several images. A historic formal house with walled forecourt entrance, like the mansion, and no foundation planting. Marble Hill House in England with a circular approach drive, like the mansion, but with no foundation planting. And a similar private residence in England with a circular entrance drive, like the mansion, and no foundation planting. Well, much to my surprise, the committee got the point. So the result, just a low ground cover, providing a stately and historically appropriate setting for a stately house. Nothing more is needed. Lush foundation planting is primarily a mid-19th century innovation or practice. It was a way of making picturesque houses have a picturesque setting, a venerable, well-established look. The practice continued well into the 20th century. Shrubs and flowers make for a homey image, and that's okay for this type of residence. And it's certainly okay for private homes today, if that's what you like. It can be pretty and impressive. It's a matter of personal taste. Foundation planting became formulaic, especially from the 1920s into the 1950s. To wit, an evergreen skirt across the front of this typical colonial revival house, with boxwood balls accenting the entrance and taller evergreens anchoring the ends. Well, this formula spread across the land, seen even on this 1970s Mount Vernon-style split foyer dwelling. And not surprisingly, this treatment began to be applied to historic houses, including Gunston Hall. This is the 1750s home of George Mason, author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the basis for the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. Gunston is a National Historic Landmark and a museum property, but its landscaping made it look like a 1950s colonial revival home in an upscale suburban neighborhood. Fortuitously, Gunston's plantings were causing moisture problems, and happily it was acknowledged that foundation plantings weren't really appropriate to the colonial period anyway. So away they all went, and Gunston achieved a more authentic historic image, one that few could say is really aesthetically unpleasant. Okay, Gunston's opposite side, the garden side, offered bigger issues. The bones of its original garden layout were intact, consisting of 4 quarter-acre square beds, each framed by gravel paths. The center path was bordered by its original boxwood planted by George Mason in the mid-18th century, a remarkable survival. In the course of 2.5 centuries, the boxwood had grown impressively huge. But we have to remember that Gunston's boxwoods were originally intended to be kept as very low borders for beds similar to this example. Moreover, the old boxwood conflicted with an 18th century theory and practice of garden design. This means that from the house, the formal layout of the garden is meant to be seen as a patterned carpet spread before it, and from the bottom of the garden, the house serves as an architectural screen or backdrop for the garden. Now, I should note that the decorative patterns in each of the square beds shown here are an early 20th century colonial revival addition made when the property was still in private ownership. This doesn't mean that colonial gardens didn't have decorative patterns in their beds. It's just that there is no historic evidence that such fancy patterns originally existed at Gunston. But they did exist in some cases, such as at Sabine Hall, also in Virginia, where the original complex pattern of walks and beds has been maintained since the mid-18th century, keeping this 18th century garden design concept in play. So the house serves as architectural backdrop for the garden, and from the house we look down on the complex design of the beds with a view to the Rappahannock River in the distance. Now it's likely the beds were more heavily planted in colonial times than today. And a prodigious version of this effect is Schonbrunn Palace in Vienna, Austria. The palace serves as architectural backdrop to a richly patterned garden, and the garden's elaborate layout is readily visible from the palace windows. For better or for worse, Gunston's billowy and bulky boxwood negated this effect. From the house you saw only a narrow path, and looking back from the bottom of the garden, the house was barely visible. Several years ago, the boxwoods were trimmed to re-establish the visual presence of the house. But sadly, the boxwoods eventually began to succumb to the dreaded boxwood decline, leading to a struggle to keep the bushes on life support as they steadily lost any aesthetic quality. Well, this situation fostered serious discussion about the need for a comprehensive garden restoration. Happily, the decision was made to do it, a big and costly commitment, but a much overdue one. Before going into the restoration design, I want to note an important aspect of the garden's original layout, a discovery made during the course of archaeological investigations. In examining the center path, archaeologists revealed that its original width, reinstated here near the house, was exactly the same as the width of the garden side porch, as well as that of the house's center hall. This formed a visual and physical synthesis of Gunston's architecture and landscape. Indeed, this led to noticing that this phenomenon was a common design characteristic in much 18th century garden layout. For instance, we see the original garden of the Wren building at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg depicted in the 1740 Bodleian plate engraving. Note that the central path is the same width as the building's central pavilion. Now, we'll talk more about this garden later. Well, this 1765 watercolor of Drayton Hall shows that the entrance avenue is the same width as the pair of front steps. A similar phenomenon was observed in the recent restoration of the North Garden at Mount Vernon. The center path is the same width as the central pavilion of Washington's greenhouse. I've noticed this too in several European examples, including the Neue Palais in Potsdam, Germany, the suburban palace of the Kaisers. The central walk is the same width as the palace's engaged portico. A striking example of this design phenomenon is the Nymphenburg Palace in Munich. Here, the central alley appears to be the same width as the central block of the palace itself. But looking at an aerial view, we see that it's actually the same width of just the central block's central pavilion. So look for these relationships when you visit historic gardens. But we need to return to Gunston's boxwood. Now, removing 250-year-old boxwood planted by George Mason, the founding father, is a sensitive issue. But to authentically recreate Mason's garden, hard reality had to be recognized. The boxwoods were too far gone and inconsistent to be preserved. So they've been removed, a difficult judgment call. This scary scene is the beginning of the restoration, with the infrastructure being installed. And this is looking in the opposite direction. Now, this is indeed an extreme makeover. However, several hundred boxwood cuttings were taken from the original and are being rooted and nursed in Mount Vernon. So Mason's boxwoods are guaranteed a form of preservation, and some will be available for purchase. And some of the boxwood's massive trunks have been saved for eventual carving into special artifacts. Mason's boxwoods, thus, were not all sent to the dump. The complete reconstruction of George Mason's garden, based on years of archaeological investigation, documentary research, and study of precedents, has been designed and is now proceeding. I'll show several conceptual images of the garden as it will look following restoration. This is the view from Gunston's garden side porch, looking down on the restored wide center path bordered by low edging boxwood. And the new edging boxwood will be a blight-resistant cultivar. A bird's-eye view shows the quarter-acre square beds. Their outlines were intact, as were their bordering paths. Now, Gunston's garden was not just decorative. It supplied much of the food for the extensive Gunston community, as well as the hospitality required of a wealthy planter. Edible plants here likely exceeded ornamental ones, and will do so in the restored garden. And following English precedent, this was a walled garden. But as with most colonial American gardens, Gunston's garden was enclosed with a wooden paling fence rather than a brick wall. A similar English garden, but enclosed by a brick wall, is seen in the 18th century print on the right. Gunston's archaeological investigations found firm evidence of wooden fence posts. A tall wooden fence offered some protection from weather and deer, as well as other plant-nibbling creatures. At the bottom of the garden was a central platform for viewing Mason's Deer Park and the Potomac River beyond. This platform and the series of steep earth terraces survive. And from the platform, we have this view of the Potomac in the distance. And this photo shows the newly installed fence posts framing the gateway to the observation platform. The consultant's original design for the fence posts called for topping the posts with generic-style urns. I suggested we consider instead a detail that more directly related to the architecture of the house. We know, for instance, that William Buckland, who designed and executed Gunston's elegant interiors and porches, owned a copy of Batty Langley's Gothic Architecture Improved, published in 1742. Langley's book includes this design for a Gothic garden seat. Its ogee arches were the likely inspiration for the ogee arches on Gunston's garden side porch. Now note the finial topping its roof. Following the suggestion, it was copied for the garden gate posts, reinforcing a kinship between architecture and garden. Of course, we can't document that such finials were ever there, but they provide some talking points. Also note that the fence rails are set on a diagonal to shed water and leaves, a common practical practice. A similar treatment is found on a Williamsburg garden fence. The Gunston Garden is scheduled for completion in 2021 and is one of the most comprehensive historic garden restoration projects of recent years, and worth a visit. Okay, we'll now peruse several other Virginia sites where transformations have taken place. This is Belle Grove, a National Trust property. It also had an inevitable mishmash of foundation planting skirting the facade. It was removed in the 1980s and replaced with low-growing plants to, quote, ease the transition from house to ground. A half-baked compromise. Finally, these softening plants were removed in 2003. So now the house rises properly uncluttered from grade, revealing its original low earthen terrace. Next, one of my favorite Virginia historic sites is Brandon. Its plantation house at the top of the drawing is an impressive 7-part Anglo-Palladian composition. Stretching before it is a broad lawn, and then a series of rectangular beds like Gunston's, leading to the James River. Several years ago, I gave a version of this talk to a local chapter of the Garden Club of Virginia, and shared this slide. It shows Brandon with the usual array of old Virginia landscape favorites, boxwood, magnolias, and crepe myrtle, grown into a Victorian tangle of flora. I stated that the house had lost its visual connection with its wonderful garden. Masked by this range of unmanaged flora, it no longer effectively served its intended role as the garden's architectural backdrop. Well, the group began to stir and murmur. Then I realized, oh my gosh, Brandon's owner is in the audience. Well, to my surprise and relief, she came up to me afterwards and said, "You are exactly right. I don't like any of that stuff. I agree with you. It's not appropriate, and I can't get any light on that side of the house because of it. I want you to come to Brandon, and we'll tag everything that needs to go and get rid of it." I said, "Well, sure, I'll be glad to." What else could I say? Well, we did, and this is the result. A couple of blocks were left to frame the house's center section, but the clearing away revealed Brandon's original shallow earth platform, and it also stunningly revealed Brandon's strong Palladian character based on this design published by Palladio. So this is an important lesson in garden management. You have to ask what is supposed to be doing the speaking, and the answer will usually be evident. Well, while we're discussing Brandon, we should take a look at the opposite side, the entrance front. This 1970 photograph shows the house well anchored with neatly trimmed boxwood, and with a bit of ivy on the right wing. We contrast this with a photograph taken after the owner decided to denude the entrance front of its foundation planting, as she did on the opposite side. Putting the before and after views together, we might admit that the 1970 image makes a prettier picture. The more recent image looks somewhat austere by comparison. But there is no absolute right or wrong answer here. Brandon is a private residence, not a museum. There is no requirement to exhibit the house as it appeared during a distant time of its colonial past. Nevertheless, the owner felt it more important for the house to convey an 18th century character in its setting than a mid-20th century look, even though the 20th century treatment may be easier on our eyes. Also, the fact that Brandon is a designated National Historic Landmark imposes some implied obligation to respect the building's primary period of significance, however contrary that may be to contemporary personal taste. This helped justify the decision to remove the foundation planting on both sides, a decision I respect. A second positive example of intervention by a private owner is Shirley. Although it's long been opened for tours, Shirley has been the home of the Carter family since the 17th century. The current mansion dates from the 1730s. The enormous holly tree in front may well have been a remnant of a colonial landscaping plan. But again, what is supposed to be doing the speaking? The tree had outlived its meaning. I admit it was a venerable relic, but it has become an intrusive one. So Charles Carter, Shirley's current owner, undertook extraction, producing an uncompromised view of the stately house. The extraction also reinstated an uncluttered axial approach, one flanked by pairs of original ancillary structures. This was a judgment call, and judgment calls are not always easy to make, let alone justify. A third example of landscape issues involving a private residence is the Keeling House, a charming mid-18th century manor house in what is now the city of Virginia Beach. The house is noted for its handsome colonial brickwork. We see it here in a 1930s photo when the house stood unoccupied. Some years ago, the then owner invited me to the house to discuss some preservation concerns and options. Having never been there, I welcomed the opportunity to visit it and get some updated photographs. However, when I arrived, this is how I found the place. I said to the owner as politely as I could, "I'm afraid it's going to be difficult to photograph." He confessed a lot of shrubbery was in the way, but he said his wife liked it, and as long as she liked it, it was going to stay. A particular concern was the ivy growing on the walls. Ivy feeds off the lime in old mortar joints and can cause permanent damage. Fortunately, the property later sold, and the new owners have cleaned it up. It still has a few boxwood and a little ivy on the wall, but this is a 500% improvement. Again, with such a structure, even one privately owned, what is supposed to be doing the speaking? A rare artifact, even a privately owned one such as the Keeling House, merits informed management. Another famous Virginia landmark is the 1770s Kenmore, home of George Washington's sister, Betty. It's long been a museum property owned and exhibited by a private foundation. Though originally rural, Kenmore is now occupying just one block of downtown Fredericksburg. We get a hint of the gentle character of its setting in this 1950s postcard view. Its garden side was one of the Garden Club of Virginia's earliest restoration projects, designed by landscape architect Charles Gillette and installed in the early 1940s. Following standard precedents, it had rectangular beds bordered with boxwood. Now the problem is that many people have a reluctance to be assertive in garden management. They hesitate intervening too aggressively with living things and fail to exercise a critical eye in determining what a garden is supposed to say. So lacking critical control, by the 1990s, Kenmore's boxwood borders had grown to nearly 12 feet. Recognizing that things had gotten out of hand, a new garden master plan was drawn up. Formidable control was undertaken. So following a massive makeover, we see in this winter view that the formerly hidden house is now revealed, and a summer view, looking on the garden from the house, we see Gillette's pattern as intended. Now, Kenmore's garden is completely conjectural, since later houses had once stood on its site, destroying any archaeological evidence needed to determine the original garden's layout. But this design is appropriate to the period and is now being properly controlled. Well, let's now go to Kenmore's other side. I took this photo of Kenmore's entrance front in 1969, showing the inevitable parade of boxwood and some young trees. By the 1990s, these same trees were overpowering the house, but the boxwood had been removed except for 2 clumps in the foreground. Against huge outcry from tree huggers, Kenmore's director decided to have the trees removed, since they had no historic justification and also posed a threat to the house. We see a striking change, and this was fortunate action because a damaging storm came through Fredericksburg some months later, and the trees could have easily toppled on the house, causing severe damage. They are not missed, nor are the 2 box bushes. Now, adding to the mix regarding Kenmore's grounds, we see a sketch detail from a 1797 fire insurance policy showing the house and several of its outbuildings. Interestingly, the sketch shows dotted lines connecting the garden side of the house with its 2 flanking dependencies, the kitchen on the left and the laundry on the right. We interpret these lines as wooden fences, screening the garden from what were essentially work areas. Other dotted lines on the right side enclose yet another work area, located behind the laundry, probably not a place of any aesthetic character. If you can read the fine writing in the kitchen and laundry rectangles, you see it describes them as, quote, wood covered with wood. That means they are wood frame structures covered with wood shingle roofs, flammable materials of interest to a fire insurance company. But viewing the photo of current conditions shown above the insurance sketch, the dependencies are brick covered with slate roofing, and there is no wood fence connecting them to the mansion. These dependencies are 20th century colonial revival reconstructions. Those in charge of Kenmore's initial restoration apparently wanted to make the dependencies more architecturally compatible with the main house. So what do we make of these insurance sketches in terms of Kenmore's historic landscape? It means that originally there was definitely a physical separation between Kenmore's ornamental side and its more functional service side. To confirm the more prosaic character of Kenmore's entrance front, we have this rare 1860s photo definitely showing the kitchen dependency on the left as a wood frame building, not a very pretty one. The laundry obviously matched it. And we also see a circular drive in front of the house, not a long brick-paved walk as now exists. The circular drive certainly offered a more practical approach to the house for horse-drawn vehicles, and most likely was an original feature, one that warrants archaeological investigation. Such circular entrance drives were relatively common for fine colonial estates. We have a print of Cliveden, near Philadelphia, showing its curved drive with an approaching carriage. And of course there is Mount Vernon, with its circular drive providing a ceremonial entrance to the house. So perhaps it was George Washington who inspired his sister to do something similar at Kenmore. So the question before us is, should the long-term plan of the foundation that owns and exhibits Kenmore incorporate in its future plans replacing the colonial revival brick dependencies with wooden ones matching the photo, erecting the fences to screen the work areas as indicated in the fire insurance policy, and recreating the circular drive if further research reveals that this was likely an original feature? Or do we maintain the tidier colonial revival character of the complex seen here? For a museum property, it's a matter of determining one's interpretation philosophy. But whatever is decided needs to be convincingly justified. In addition to Kenmore and Gunston, I serve on an advisory committee for Stratford Hall. This museum property is the historic home of the Lees and the birthplace of Robert E. Lee. On one of my visits, I wondered about the historic appropriateness of the mansion's flanking rows of boxwood and adjacent trees. Historic views showed no precedent for the boxwood. Moreover, they and the adjacent trees and other shrubs hid the fact that the mansion's curtilage or core complex was anchored by 4 symmetrically placed dependencies. We see them in the aerial photo and on the grid that determined the layout of the dependencies. So I took it on myself to bring up the boxwood matter with the landscape architect who serves as Stratford's consultant. He agreed that the boxwood had no historic justification, and he tactfully convinced Stratford's board of directors that they should be removed, including the large magnolia on the left, which was causing structural damage to the house. Well, the directors concurred. So the boxwoods and magnolia tree were duly expunged. The lower trees and shrubs, which you see against the sides of the house, will be removed as well. They will go along with the massive brick steps added to either side of the house by Fisk-Kimball in the 1930s. The steps are overwrought and are completely conjectural. Moreover, they are pulling away from the house. They will be replaced with single flights as determined by evidence in the mansion's brick walls and other documentation. Stratford's landscape and Kimball's restoration were done with the best of intentions and available expertise. But new questioning and research are enabling a more plausible historic image to be presented. One aspect of Stratford's landscaping that I hope can eventually be addressed is the view from the mansion across the fields and woodlands to the Potomac River, a mile away. The relationship, both visual and historical, of these plantations to the tidal rivers is of critical importance to understanding how the plantations functioned. I took this photo some 25 years ago when the view of the river and Maryland beyond were intact. This same vista, photographed just a year ago, shows the distant trees have increased in height, making the river no longer visible. Lowering the height of more than 100 yards of woodlands is no small task. So regrettably, we may not see the historic view be reinstated in the foreseeable future. Preserving such vistas is one of landscape maintenance's greatest challenges. And now Williamsburg's Governor's Palace, one of the nation's most laudable reconstructed historic buildings. It's now older than the original Governor's Palace, destroyed in 1781, and has received countless visitors over the past 90 years. Some years ago, I gave a version of this talk at a Williamsburg seminar. I questioned the 4 large trees in the palace forecourt, hugging the building. I boldly stated they had no historic justification. They are antithetical to 18th century garden practice. Moreover, the Bodleian plate engraving showed just 4 oval beds in the forecourt, no trees. Now I have to confess, it pays to do your homework before you spout off. After my talk, a Williamsburg employee came up and quietly said to me, "Calder, the trees have already been removed." So of course I went red-faced. But I was not completely wrong, because I later noted that only 2 of the trees had been removed. 2 yet remained. Borosidophobia apparently was at work here. Anyway, I happened to be in Williamsburg recently and chanced to take a look. The remaining 2 trees have disappeared. So things can happen if you wait long enough. The forecourt oval beds shown in the Bodleian engraving are now uncompromised. With these comments on the Governor's Palace, I'll close the first part of this discussion of managing historic landscapes and gardens with some summary observations. We need to recognize that the historic landscapes and gardens we have perused, and those we'll consider in the second part of this discussion, are composed of living organisms. These living things, trees, shrubs, vines, flowers, edible plants, weeds, and even lawns, are in a constant state of change in size and shape. Some have short lives, some can live for more than a century. We collect and cultivate selected elements of flora and arrange them for both aesthetic and utilitarian purposes, with a certain look or use in mind. Managing that look or use requires ongoing control, whether we want the look to stay fixed, as in regular mowing a lawn, or be allowed to evolve, such as permitting a sapling to grow into a shade tree. These examples of landscapes and gardens I have selected to discuss relate to specific historic buildings. As an architectural historian, I have a particular interest in how landscape settings and gardens interact with architecture, how they do or don't complement architecture, and vice versa. And we'll see how this works in some more complex situations, such as the rotunda, in part 2 of this presentation. So please stay tuned for more. Thank you.